Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 642. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about the Maritime Silk Road, 72-hour visas, and places like the Temple of the Six Banyan Trees and the Mausoleum of the Nanyue King as we go to Guangzhou, China. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Guangzhou. I'd like to welcome to the show Bill Abbott from Chicago and also from blabbit.weebly.com, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, who's come to talk to us about another lesser-known place in China, Guangzhou. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good to be with you today.
I say lesser known as if it were some little tiny village off in the hinterlands, which it is not.
Yeah, we are talking about one of the largest cities in China and in the world, and I think it's probably number 2 after Shanghai. I think that Beijing and Guangzhou are kind of right in that same type area in terms of population.
14.5 million is what I'm seeing, and I don't know how old those statistics are. Why should someone go to Guangzhou?
Chris, you've mentioned in your shows about Hong Kong how Hong Kong is kind of China with English subtitles. Right. And I can't agree more. I think if you want to delve into the Chinese culture, that Hong Kong is a really good place to start. But when you're ready to go behind the curtain, I think Guangzhou should be one of the places that you consider. It really has been the center of Cantonese culture for 2,000 years. And one thing to remember about Hong Kong is there really wasn't a lot there before the 1840s when the British moved in. So, Hong Kong's a great fun place, but when you want to go deeper into the history and culture, Guangzhou is the place to go. And I might add, it's quite a bit less expensive than Hong Kong, which can be very expensive for a tourist.
Okay. And what is your connection with, and I've been saying Guangzhou and you're saying Guangzhou, so I'm going to try and switch my brain here.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm probably going to do that. So I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years when I was young, and then I came back to the United States and studied Chinese in college and in grad school. So I learned Cantonese first when I was in Hong Kong, and then I studied Mandarin later. And I met my wife when I was in college, and she is from the Guangzhou area. So ever since we met and married, we've gone back every 2 or 3 years to visit her family. And I've really grown to love this area of the world.
Excellent. Well, and what kind of itinerary do you recommend?
So I would start in Guangzhou for the Mandarin speakers.
And that's the difference. Okay, got it.
Yeah, so
I thought I was just saying it wrong, so I feel better now.
No, Guangzhou is the Cantonese and Guangzhou is the Mandarin. So I'll try and remember to give you both pronunciations and probably try and stick with the Mandarin where I can, because that's what people will be more familiar with. And that's what your guidebooks will use too.
Well, and we should say just a quick difference between when we talk about Mandarin versus Cantonese. It is usually said that they're a different dialect, although really, if it weren't politically the same country, we would call it a different language. The only reason it's called the same language is they have the same written language. But if I speak to you in Cantonese and you speak to me in Mandarin, we're going to have a hard time communicating.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When I was living in Hong Kong and didn't understand any Mandarin, even though I spoke Cantonese quite well, I couldn't understand what other people were saying when they spoke Mandarin. So when I was in college, I remember there was a book on linguistics we were reading that said that Cantonese and Mandarin are more different than Portuguese and Romanian, which are both Romance languages. Right. So if these were different countries, we'd probably call them different languages.
Absolutely. But I'm sure we would, yeah. Well, and Cantonese has, and stop me if I'm wrong, I've learned some Mandarin and no Cantonese. Cantonese has 6 tones and Mandarin has 4.
Yeah, I think we're pretty settled on Mandarin with the 4 tones, but I've seen different systems, some that say Cantonese has 10 tones and others that say 7. So it's a fun language. It's a little more guttural, whereas Mandarin I feel is a little, it's pretty. It's sing-song, and Cantonese is kind of rough, but I kind of like it.
Excellent. Well, and when we say tones, just one last thing on languages. This is where you can get yourself into trouble. This is the don't call your mother a horse, as my Chinese teacher used to say, because the word ma, for instance, in Mandarin, depending whether you say ma, or ma, is, I don't know which order I did that in, hemp to scold mother or horse. So that is different than we have in a lot of the Western languages.
Yeah,
anyway.
Absolutely. That's the hardest part about the language. Well, except for writing the characters and reading those.
Yeah, I think that is easily the hardest part. I never got past 200. Excellent. So we're going to Guangzhou or Guangzhou, and you're going to give us an itinerary.
Exactly. So I would start off with 2 or 3 days in Guangzhou, and then I would do a day trip to a neighboring city that's still part of the same metropolis that's called Foshan or Foshan in Mandarin. Okay. And then I would take a couple of days and go off to an island, which is called Hailing Island. Along the way, there's another place that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site called Huiping or Kaiping that has some interesting structures to look at. So if you have a week, that would be a summary of the itinerary that I would do.
Excellent. And we talked about Hong Kong. This is something that could easily be added on to a trip to Hong Kong or Macau because either one of those is, 60 to 100 miles away?
Yeah, very close, very easily to connect. I mean, if you're coming from Hong Kong, you could fly. It's a really short flight. But you could take a boat up the river. You could take a bus. You could go on the train. So there's many different ways to get there, and it's very quick and convenient. Make sure that you know about the visa situation, of course, before you go anywhere in the world. This is one of those places that if you're a U.S. citizen, you're going to have to get a visa, although things have changed, and recently they've started allowing visa-free trips, and Guangzhou is one of those cities where you can take advantage of this, but there are certain restrictions.
Well, when you say visa-free, you're talking about the transit visa.
Right.
And that's a 72-hour visa in Guangzhou, I think.
But there are restrictions on it, right? That can't be your final destination. You have to be going on to somewhere else.
Yeah, we just did that on our way to Japan. We spent a night in Shanghai, saw my Chinese daughter, and we used a transit visa, which had no cost. You just basically got into a different line as you came into the country. And I think that, it's 72 hours in Guangzhou. It's even longer. Now it's 144 hours in Shanghai, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, interestingly enough.
For the one, if you're flying into the Guangzhou airport, you can go all over the province with that one. You don't have to stay just in the city. So for the itinerary that we're talking about today, you could take advantage of this if you don't have a Chinese visa. So like you did, I did it in Shanghai a while ago. But now I got my brand new 10-year multiple entry visa, so I'm not going to have to worry about it for a while.
Well, and that is nice. When I was first in Shanghai, went up to the consulate, spent all day. I think it took me 2 trips, but then you still only end up with a 1 entry 30-day visa. So this 10-year visa basically means you've got a visa for the length of time you have your passport.
Exactly.
Excellent. What are we doing in the city first?
On your first day, I'd keep it kind of light, depending on when you're coming in and your jet lag and everything that you're going through. But a couple of places that I would try and see. The first one would be Samin Island or Xiamen Island. This is an island in the river, and we didn't really talk about the geography much, but this is the Pearl River, which is the third major river system in China after the Yellow and the Yangtze River. So this island is in the river, and during that same Opium War period when Hong Kong was taken by the British, this island became a foreign concession. There's not a lot of huge sites here, but it's very popular. It's a very peaceful part of the city and a place many people might consider to be the prettiest part of the city. It's got a lot of these old Western classical buildings that were used as consulates. And one interesting thing about it, you see a lot of people taking pictures there, which isn't strange, but they might be taking pictures of a watch on somebody's arm or shoes that they're wearing.
Okay.
And if you don't know in advance what is going on, then it might seem a little strange, but a lot of the advertisements in the area are taken here. So these are professional type photographers who were taking pictures, and they liked the backdrop of the classical style buildings, I guess, on the island for whatever they're taking a picture of to advertise.
Got it. Okay.
Nice place to wander around if you get into town where it's too late everything's closed and you want to get out and see something, then this is a good place to go, and really nice parks and buildings. And if you've got more time on that first day, then I would head over to the Chun Clan Ancestral Hall, which is not too far away from this island. A couple of stops on the metro. And if you've been to Hong Kong and you're familiar with the great metro system there, the Guangzhou metro system is very nice as well. I wouldn't say it's quite as nice as the Hong Kong system, but it's very good. And it's a great means of transportation to get around the city. There are, of course, taxis as well, but this is very convenient and cheap. And so you can take the metro over to this place. And this Chun Clan Ancestral Hall is a very interesting and different kind of a place. So it was established by the Chun families in the area. So throughout, I think there were over 70 different families that established this place as a school and kind of a shrine. This was back in the late 1800s. So I would go in there, and what I really remember and what I took pictures of was some of the carvings in there. It really gives you an idea of kind of this Southern Chinese architectural style there. So a very unique building. And like I said, if you have time on that first day, that's where I would spend it. If you only have one day in Guangzhou, though, the area that I would take you to is the Yuexiu district or the Yutsu district, which is, and there's several sites there that are kind of clustered together and make a really nice day. So on your second day, if you've got 2 days, I would do that. And starting off over there, very nice park. There's a statue of these 5 rams that have some history with the city. Supposedly were the immortals rode in on these rams. And so you can take a quick picture there. It's kind of an icon for the city. They've got a tower there in that area as well that is probably about 600 years old. There's a great museum in there called the Guangzhou City Museum, which will give you a lot of the history of the city. Also nearby is a Buddhist temple called the Temple of the Six Banyan Trees. And I'm not sure if there are even any banyan trees there anymore within the temple, but it's very famous. It was in a poem from, I want to say, the Tang or the Song period. So we're talking about 10th or 11th century. But this very famous poet, Su Dongbo, he wrote about this temple, and so a lot of people go there. It's very popular. There's a very nice pagoda there. I think the temple has been there since maybe the 5th century. Obviously, there's been some restoration, and I think the pagoda's been changed a little bit, but very popular, very nice place to go.
Well, you were close. It's the 6th century. So
okay.
That's a pretty long time ago, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, 537 is when they said it was originally, but as you say, rebuilt several times.
The best site, and I've kind of saved the best for last in this area, is the mausoleum of the Nanya king. I think this is one of the best museums that I've been to in China. It's really quite fascinating. This is a tomb of an early ruler of the emperor, so we're going way back now to the Han Dynasty period, which is 200 BC.
Huh.
And this ruler was sent down from the emperor, which I believe during the Han Dynasty, we're talking about Xi'an was the capital, so way off in the northwest. And he's sent down to be the ruler of this southern area. And they didn't find this tomb until the 1980s, I believe. And it's just been very well done. It's very modern. You can go down inside. There are several artifacts that they dug up. I don't think that it was ever disturbed like a lot of graves are. And there's a jade burial suit in there that this ruler was buried in. So if you only have time for one thing in Guangzhou, this would be the thing that I would go and see. It's really quite fascinating.
Interesting.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. Arigatou gozaimasu. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
If you got a little more time, if you have another day in Guangzhou, then I would head off over to the Newtown area. This part of Guangzhou is gleaming skyscrapers and lots of business people running around, and you really might think, if you didn't know any better, that you were in any big city in the world. The reason to come over here, or the reason I wanted to go over here, is there are a new museum and a new opera house that they've built over in this area. And so I was just there last month and visited both of these places. And the new Guangdong Museum, which is a provincial museum, has some fascinating exhibits there. Chinese porcelain, carvings, things that come from different parts of the province. There was an ink stone exhibit, which doesn't sound that interesting, but was much better than it sounds. So,
an ink stone. So this is used for printing?
So this is what they would use to put their ink on.
Got it.
And then when they're using that for the Chinese calligraphy.
The
architecture of the museum, and then right next door, the Opera House, is very modern and very unique. Now, the Opera House we went over and went into, but they weren't giving tours at the time. So if that's something that you want to do, make sure that you plan for it. It's very interesting on the outside. I've heard some people describe the architecture to, a stone. It's very unique. The Cantonese opera, I'm not a real Chinese opera buff. I've seen Cantonese opera a few times. I think people say this about Italian opera, that you love it or you hate it. And I think that my Cantonese friends have kind of told me the same thing about Cantonese opera. But there seemed to be a lot of Western theater that was going on there as well. So you might want to check that out. That pretty much wraps up Guangzhou. But from here, I'd like to branch out a little bit and do a day trip to Fuzan, which is very close, depending on where you're coming from in Guangzhou, maybe 10 kilometers. The metro system actually goes to this neighboring town. So you can do that if you like, or grab a taxi.
Well, you mentioned grabbing a taxi. Just a couple words about that. So we've talked about that in the recent episode, which you haven't heard yet, on Beijing, about using the DD app, which is their version of Uber, or I don't know if there's a taxi app, but I do know that taxis are cheap, but you might want to have wherever you're going written down in Chinese. Because walking into a taxi and expecting the taxi driver to understand English is a foolhardy endeavor, in my experience.
Last month when we were there, we tried to use the DD and we're having some technical problems with it. But my wife and I both speak Chinese, so it was no problem for us to use the taxis. But yeah, like anywhere where you don't speak the language, I think getting the hotel to write down where you want to go in advance.
And then walking away with a hotel card with the address of the hotel in Chinese so you can get back is also a good thing.
Absolutely, yes. Do not expect the taxi drivers to speak any English. Yep. So Fuzan is our next destination, and there are 3 things here to see, and I think it makes a great day trip from Guangzhou. The first place I would take you is to Jumiao, which is an ancient temple there. It's a Taoist temple. There's a metro stop that is right there, so you can get there pretty conveniently. I've been here many times in the past, but the last time that I was here, I went into this exhibition that they had on Chinese Kung Fu.
Okay.
And I didn't know that in the past, either I didn't realize that it was there or we never went in and just focused on the temple, which is very nice and very famous. When people mention Foshan, they always talk about this temple that's been around for hundreds of years. But this town also was the place of a couple of these Kung Fu masters. So there's a memorial inside of the grounds of the temple to Yip Man and Wang Fei Hong. And I'm not really into the martial arts, but I found the exhibit quite nice and very interesting. There's some things in there about Bruce Lee and the Kung Fu movies, and that's definitely something, if you're interested, that you should do while you're visiting this temple there.
Okay. Do you have to try and grab the pearl from the master's hand before you can leave the temple again? Or some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. Go watch old episodes of the TV show Kung Fu with Keith Carradine. But
the second place I would take you to is a place called the Liang Garden, and it's less than 2 kilometers away from the Jumiao Temple. So you can walk there if you want. We haven't really talked much about gardens yet, so I think one of the things you need to do while you're in the Guangzhou area is go to a classical Chinese garden. And it's said that this garden is one of the top gardens in the region.
I'm seeing one of the top 4.
Yeah, I've been there. It's very nice. It's very Southern style. There's willows and koi. And so it's just a very nice place to wander and take some great photos. And
how would I tell a southern style garden from a northern style garden?
The intricacies are lost on me as well. You can find gardens, some of the areas up north in Shanghai and Suzhou.
Suzhou is what I think of, yeah.
Very famous for their gardens too. I think you'll find some of the plant life to be a little bit different just because of the different climates between the two places. The third stop that I would make would be at this place called the Nanfeng Ancient Kiln.
Okay.
This was another place that I had never been to until last month, and I found it quite fascinating. So Ever since I first started going to Guangzhou, I loved the porcelain and the figurines that were created in the area. And back in the 80s, I'd buy up all kinds of this stuff and box it up and take it back home every trip that I made, so that our home is full of this art now, because it was dirt cheap. This is the place where a lot of this was made, and they've made this now into somewhat of a museum or park. You can see the two ancient kilns. They're underneath a structure, but they're parallel going up the hillside, and they're quite long. And you can peek your head inside. They don't use them anymore. You can check out the kilns where all this porcelain was made. But then around the complex, there are demonstrations that go on pottery. And so you can wander in and out of these shops and see artisans working on their craft. I thought it was a great way to end a nice day trip out in the Foshan area.
When you mentioned it being cheap, after the Opium Wars, there's a time where any middle-class family in England has a China tea set or has china from China, because they were bringing back tea and they needed something for ballast, and so they would bring the porcelain back literally as ballast in the ship.
Oh, wow.
And so it was very inexpensive, which is one of the reasons why you see that heavily influence of that ceramic style in England in a certain time period, sort of going through the Victorian England, I want to say.
Prices they're much higher now. I don't bring back so much anymore, but probably cheaper than Hong Kong if you wanted to pick up a few things here.
Because Hong Kong is so expensive in the markets.
Yes. Yeah, it really is.
I'm kidding, actually, because I think Hong Kong is so cheap in the markets. But this is cheaper still. Interesting.
Well, I think it depends on what you're buying.
Yep.
When you're going to Temple Street or somewhere like that, you're buying knockoffs, right?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. The Calvin Klein and such, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're talking about the porcelain or cloisonné or something like that, I guess usually when I'm in Hong Kong on those street markets, I don't see as much of that, or
craft work.
Yeah, it's really low quality. Okay. Yeah, these are great souvenirs to pick up. And we've seen Guangzhou, and we spent a day in Foshan. And so now I would like to take you on an overnight trip to finish out our itinerary. And this is logistically, I think this is best done at the end after you're a little familiar with getting around, as we discussed with the taxi drivers. And because the toughest part of this part of the trip is going to be getting there. So there's an island called Hailing Island, which is on the coast. It's south of Hong Kong. What drew me here is I read about a museum, which we'll talk about in a second, that just sounded fantastic. And so I wanted to try and figure out how I could go to this museum. So we took the bus to a city called Yangjiang, which is pretty cool, within an hour of the island. And then changed buses there and took another bus to get us on the island. So a lot of listeners may be a little scared of taking the bus and going through that whole thing. But I have to say, I mean, I do the same thing in other places like Bulgaria, where I was at a couple of months ago, and nobody really spoke English in the bus terminals or on the bus. But you figure it out. I would say China is probably no different than any other place, that you're probably going to be the only foreign face that they're seeing in some of these bus stations. So if you show them your ticket and if you get your hotel to help you write out what you want and everything, then I think it's very doable. In this part of China, you don't really have to worry about safety. I think everybody's going to be very helpful and friendly and help you try and get where you want to go. The bus ride is going to take between 4 and 5 hours. Okay. So that's why I'm suggesting spending the night there. And when you get to the island, the city that you end up in is called Zapo. And from there, you're only a couple of kilometers away from this resort area. So you'll need to take a pedicab or a taxi from there to the resort area. I wouldn't walk it. We ended up staying in the Crown Plaza resort,
Okay.
which is one of the nicest resorts I've ever stayed in. I don't stay at a lot of resorts. I'm usually doing the Airbnb thing but just a gorgeous place. And there are lots of different resorts in the same area, and it's just beautiful. I mean,
when I'm seeing white sand beaches, sort of azure blue water, kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I wasn't as impressed
is that an artist
with
rendition
the
of it?
beaches and the water. I've been a lot of places. I've been throughout the Caribbean, and I'm not as easily impressed. The resorts are quite nice. There was a big sign when we walked out of the resort to go walk along the shore, and it said, "Don't go in the water." So the waves were quite high. The water looked a little silty, so I enjoy snorkeling and those kinds of things, and I just can't imagine doing it. We walked along the beach and caught some of those ocean breezes and had a very nice time. And the resort had a lot of pools and hot tubs and things like that. There were probably, if there were more than 50 people in the resort, 50 guests, I'd be surprised. And we were there during the Thanksgiving holiday, and there was nobody there. The weather was in the mid-70s, so it was perfect. Sometimes you go into the beach, you want a little bit hotter than that. But I thought the weather was just gorgeous, and they upgraded us to an ocean view suite. I think I only paid $75 for the room for the night, and stayed in one of the most gorgeous rooms that I've ever. It's a gorgeous area, but like I said, the main reason I wanted to come here was for the museum, and it was so close to the resort that we just walked over the museum from the resort. And this museum is new. It was just created, just built a few years ago. Just off the shore from here, they found an 800-year-old ship. So we're going back to Song Dynasty times. And the museum is called the Maritime Silk Road Museum of Guangzhou. Really long name. I didn't even really know before I went here that there was a maritime Silk Road. But I think most of your listeners are going to know about the Silk Road and the trade that happened there. Well, there was this maritime Silk Road that went from different ports in China, and they were taking goods to Southeast Asia, to India, and sometimes even all the way to Africa. So this ship that they found was loaded with trade goods from China on its way south to visit these places. When they discovered it, it was mostly intact. So they used huge cranes and scooped the whole thing up and built this museum and deposited the ship right in the middle. I thought the most fascinating thing about it was they have glass enclosures all around the ship on a couple of different levels. And you can just sit and watch them. The ship is still full of all these trade goods, and they're studying them, they're taking them out, they're cleaning them, and you're watching all of this archaeological work go on right in front of you. You're looking down, and you can see all these huge jugs, all this pottery.
Got it.
And you can see people down there, right, pretty much on top of it, going through it and very carefully pulling the pieces out. Above it, you can see people walking on these beams that go across the ship. And I think if it was in the U.S. or one of the Western nations, those people would probably be on some kind of a safety harness or something. I don't know how many people have fallen off there, but people with clipboards taking notes, and then there's other people with hoses who are carefully cleaning off the artifacts as they pull them up. And I just don't know how many places in the world you can go and see this kind of archaeological work going on right in front of you. And I don't know how much longer it's going to take for them to finish this. There are other exhibits around the museum where you can learn all about the Maritime Silk Road and see some of the artifacts. But that was the most fascinating part of it to me, was just to sit there and watch this work being done.
Now, I do have to ask how much of that is interpreted for those of us whose Cantonese is a little rusty? As in no Cantonese at all?
There was enough English there
Okay.
for me to read. And I think that's an important point in some of these places that we've talked about. The English descriptions are not the same as the Chinese. You're not getting all that information. But again,
Sure.
This is another one of those really well done modern museums. I think there's an IMAX movie inside the museum too. If you find yourself in this area, I would definitely take the trip and go see this while the work is still going on. So we have
Very
one
cool.
last spot, and it's on the way back to Guangzhou from Hailing Island. And this is the UNESCO World Heritage Site that's
Okay.
in Kaiping. This is called the Kaiping Diaolo and Villages. What they have
Okay.
here are several villages with these towers. Not that tall, maybe as much as 6 stories high. These towers, there's really 3 different types. Some were built as watchtowers, and some were built for protection so that you could go up in the tower if bandits were attacking the village and close all the doors, and there were little slits that you could use your weapons through. And then the third type were really to be lived in, and some of them are very opulent. And these towers are not that old. Most of them date from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And at one point, there were 3,000 or so of these in the area. In fact, my mother-in-law in her village, they had a tower right next to their home. And my mother-in-law has told me about her going up in the tower when she was a kid and sleeping in there. And it was more of a tower for protection. But like a lot of the towers in the area, her family has tore down the upper levels, and I think maybe there's only 2 or 3 levels left. And so a lot of these towers are falling into disrepair and are being tore down. And there's still about 1,800 or so of them in the area. So they've protected them by creating these parks inside of these villages. You could spend a whole day here. There's about 6 different sites. And because it took us a couple hours to get there, and then it's a couple hours further on to Guangzhou, we had about half a day. So we bought a combination ticket that allowed us to go into any of the sites, but we only ended up making it to 3. The first one that we started off is called Jili. Very nice village. I think most people, if they're going to go one place, probably go here. It was a good place, though, to see some of these more ornate towers that were actually lived in. And the towers, for the most part, were built from money coming back into China from overseas Chinese. So people who were, for example, going to the U.S. to work, and by U.S. standards, probably not being paid very well, but by Chinese standards, they were doing okay. And so they sent this money back to China, or came back to China when they were done working in the U.S. or Australia or wherever they were at, and then used this money to build these very opulent living quarters. And sometimes the designs and the architecture on these buildings is not very Chinese, but almost looks more Western.
Western or Indian or something, but yeah, Chinese is not at all the picture that I get when I look. If you showed me these pictures and you said, guess where this is in the world, China would not be in my top 10 guesses.
They're very interesting. Inside, I thought the most interesting part, and this is a place where you're not going to get much English.
Okay.
Luckily, I had my wife next to me, and she could explain a lot of the things because she was born in the 60s in China, and the modern age hadn't arrived yet in a lot of places in China. So various implements there for grinding rice with stones and things. She could explain to me because she said, oh yeah, we used to have one of these in my grandma's house or whatever. So it was a very interesting place. We went to Jili first, and then we went to a place called the Lee Garden, which was very close by, which had a few more of these very opulent towers in a very nice garden setting. And then we ended our day at a village called Majianglong, which is still in the same area. And I really liked that place because the other places seemed a little touristy, but this place felt like a lived-in village. As you're walking around, there's chickens running around and people going about their daily lives. So I like the experience there, just to feel like, oh, this is a real place where people live. And sometimes in China, you spend a lot of your time in big cities. And so it's nice to spend a little time in the villages and see what that type of life is like.
Well, one of the interesting things about this site, which I'd never heard of, was with the recent age of it, with these being built to the late 1800s into the 1900s, it really gives you a hint that there was some instability. And these are built so you can protect yourself from bandits. And so you go to the Forbidden City, or we go to these places and see some of the older dynasties, and we forget that, somewhat spurred on by the contact with the West, that there was periods of great instability in China later on.
They really did need this protection. And through some of my other travels in Italy and other places, you see the same type of thing.
Oh, yeah. And whenever you see towers and castles and things like that, you know that they went through a hard time.
Exactly. That's the end of the itinerary.
Okay.
We really haven't spoken much about food. Of course, this is Cantonese cuisine,
right?
So a lot of it's going to be the same as Hong Kong, but like I said before, less expensive than Hong Kong. You have to try dim sum. One of my favorite restaurants, and a place that I went to for the first time in the 1980s, is called the Guangzhou restaurant.
Okay.
And this is a very classic place right in the old town of Guangzhou. Very nice atrium garden there, and a very nice place to get dim sum when you're in the area. This last month, we tried a new place that was really upper scale, called Panxi or Bun Kai in Cantonese, and it was a bit more expensive, but the food was quite good. And some really inventive twists with classic Chinese dishes like barbecued pork, some flavors that I'd never really tasted before. So if you want to splurge one night, that would be somewhere that you might consider. There's a very nice garden in there as well. My wife's aunt and uncle live in Guangzhou, so they're very up to date with the latest restaurants to go to. So last month they took us to a place called Yudian, which has a couple of establishments in the Guangzhou area now. And it was quite good. It was bursting at the seams. We had to wait for a while, but the food was very good and very inexpensive there. So those are a couple of ideas for places to go and eat. Dim sum is a little difficult for somebody the very first time. The whole process is very different than...
and they still do it in a traditional fashion in Guangzhou, where you get the people with the carts rather than a menu?
It depends.
Okay.
But I think more and more you're getting to the menu. Nobody's pushing the carts by, but you've got pictures and you can write down exactly how many you want of each thing. And there are some very tame things on the dim sum menu that
absolutely.
I think...
Some of the dumplings especially, I think, are very approachable by people. The tripe a little less so, but the dumplings, I think a lot of people can find a good dumpling or bun that they'll enjoy.
I'm a big fan of the chicken feet, but...
Less so for me.
I wasn't the first time I tried it, and that's the thing.
I just
about
find it kind of
place.
Pointless because there's just not a lot of meat in chicken feet.
Well, as I learned how to eat them, I found that you just have to pop the whole thing in your mouth and spit out the gristle and knuckles and everything. That's really the only way to do it. I think like anywhere, you try stuff, and even if you don't like it the first time, you try it again. I don't know if you've ever tried, Chris, the soybean milk.
I'm not sure I have.
The first time I tried soybean milk, I did not like it at all. I thought I was going to vomit. And I tried it again, luckily, and I just love it. I mean, to me, it's the perfect drink if you're getting some Chinese bakery, which you're going to find to be very similar to Hong Kong. You've got all the same things, the great tarts, the egg tarts. And this soybean milk, there really isn't much to it. It's soybeans and water and sugar, but it's delicious. I would try it. In the wintertime, often they serve it hot, which is good too. There's a tart there that I think you've talked about before called the potat. It looks like the egg tart,
Okay.
but it looks kind of burnt at the top.
Okay, sure.
And this came from the Portuguese. And when I first saw these, I thought, well, I'm not getting those. Somebody burnt those. And so I didn't try them. But when I was in Lisbon a few years ago, and if you've been in Lisbon before, there's an area of the city called Belém that has a place where people line up for these things, for these, what they call the potat, or it has cream with it, and that's why it gets burnt on the top.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about.
And the Portuguese put cinnamon on it, which is delicious. You're not going to find any cinnamon in China, but you really should try that one. There's a coconut tart as well, and lots of different pineapple buns and cocktail buns that have a very sweet coconut sugary mixture in the middle that's very good. So
now, when the pineapple buns, are you talking about the buns that look like a pineapple?
Yes,
bolo yao?
Bolo bao.
Okay, bolo bao, which isn't pineapple flavored, but looks like a pineapple.
Exactly. It's got kind of this cross-hatch pattern on the top of it.
Yeah.
I think I have tried some that have some pineapple in them. And,
Got it. Okay.
And recently I've seen people putting butter in the middle of it, which looked kind of odd to me. But I'm not a foodie, but when I'm in Guangzhou, I'm very picky.
Well, the advantage I've always found with the bakery, too, is everything is displayed there. You can just point. So you need no language skills whatsoever. And this is true in China as well as any place else. You just then hand them your money, and they take the appropriate amount if you can't even get the money right.
The hardest part is you don't know what's inside the buns sometimes.
And I've had some disappointing experiences, but generally not. In China, it's likely to be a bean curd or a cream-ish kind of filling or something like that. They've occasionally come across, I think that's salmon or something like that. That wasn't what I was looking for. But generally, it's a pretty low risk, and it's also pretty cheap. So
yes, and if you don't like red bean, which the Chinese put on everything, and that's probably the worst thing that you can run into in a bun if you're not sure what's inside. So.
Right. Question for you: mentioned in the winter, and then you also mentioned when you were down at the island that there weren't a lot of people there. Best time to go? Summer's going to be a lot warmer.
Yes, I would avoid the summer.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hot, it's humid, and I think like the resort that we talked about, I think it's going to be packed. You're not going to get those great prices. I love the fall. I think the fall is perfect. I've been there a couple of times over the Thanksgiving holiday.
Although I would watch out for Golden Week.
Yes. Watch out for Chinese New Year,
avoid.
Which is usually sometime January through March in that time frame. But I wouldn't go that time of year anyway. I mean, if you're from the upper Midwest like I am, you can handle those temperatures, but it's just not that pleasant. So I wouldn't go January through March during winter. Spring is kind of rainy with the monsoonal weather that comes in. Summer is a little hot and sticky. So if you can go in the fall, I would say between the mid-September and the end of December, that's when I would go. I think that's the perfect period.
Anything else that people need to know before they go to Guangzhou?
Yes, I would just encourage people to really check this place out. I don't think it's on a lot of people's radar, but hopefully after some of the things we've covered today, more people will check it out.
Excellent. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Guangzhou or the region. I'll give you the whole region here. Where are you standing and what are you looking at? I'm
going to do something a little different. I hope it's okay, Chris. I'm going to sit down, if that's okay, instead of stand.
You have my permission.
And I'm going to say that I'm in a tea house in Guangzhou, and I've ordered my dim sum, and it's just arrived at the table, and I've got this huge bounty of delicious dumplings all laid out in front of me, and I'm grabbing my chopsticks, and I'm ready to dig in. That's the most beautiful sight that I can imagine. I mean, the resort area that we talked about was very beautiful too, with very verdant hills and the ocean breezes. But the food in Guangzhou, there's a saying, there's a Chinese saying, I'll say it in Cantonese, it's "Sick Joy Guangzhou," And I think the best way to translate that is when in Guangzhou, eat, or the best thing to do in Guangzhou is eat. And I couldn't agree more.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Guangzhou. I'll say it the other way this time.
Okay. It's language related.
Okay.
We talked about the language just a little bit. And I think we know sometimes that we Americans can be a little loud and a little frank as compared with some Europeans.
Sure.
And I think in this way, the Cantonese are kind of like Americans. If you compare them with the Japanese and the Koreans, I've had some experience in those cultures as well, and I think they're a little more reserved and a little quieter. The thing that makes me laugh is that I don't think you will ever have a louder dining experience in your life than being in a tea house where every table's full. We talked before about the Cantonese language being very coarse and guttural, but the people too they talk quite loudly. I was with a friend in an elevator, and he didn't speak Cantonese, and a couple of women got on and then got off after a couple of floors, and he said, why were they yelling at each other? And I said, well, they weren't yelling. They were just talking about what they bought during the day when they were out shopping. And so if you're a kind of a loud American, you probably won't get as many looks in Guangzhou because they're pretty loud too. But I love it. It just makes me laugh and say, hey, I'm back in Guangzhou, and I just love the people and the culture and the food and everything about this place.
Excellent. Last question. If you had to summarize Guangzhou in 3 words, what would you say?
I have to start with mouth-watering.
Well, that's consistent.
But I would also say inexpensive. We've talked about that. And also educational.
Excellent. Well, our guest again has been Bill Abbott. Bill has a site where he puts up itineraries at blabbit.weebly.com, which I'll link to. And Bill, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for this region of China.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be with you.
I heard from Diane about the show that we did about the Botswana safari that I was on. She said, I really enjoyed that podcast. I felt like I was there with the sounds of the animals and the excitement when that lion sauntered by camp. I was hoping that's the way you would feel. That's certainly the way we felt. In news of the community, if you're looking to go with the trip with Amateur Traveler to South Africa, Botswana, and Victoria Falls in May of 2019, sign up now. It's really getting to be that point. Information for the trip at amateurtraveler.com/Africa2019. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.